tell you a story of this fellow that we know as Louie. He had a real rough beginning when he was a little boy. Grew up in California, Torrance area in the 30s. And he wasn't a very good boy. He stole stuff and ran around, and his older brother was kind of the good kid, so he was kind of the not good kid. So he ran around a lot and did a lot of stuff, and he almost got caught a lot. So while he was running around and stealing stuff, he learned how to run really well, because running well makes you not get into trouble very often. So he became a very fast little boy, actually, and he got in trouble a bunch. He didn't get away every time, but his older brother finally got a hold of him and helped him focus all this energy just into running, because you can run and not get into trouble and get into good things from running. So his older brother helped him and got a hold of him and trained him and kind of straightened him out around middle school, around that time of his life. But he got really fast and won all of his races in high school, became super well known in Torrance. They called him the Torrance Tornado because they really liked coming up with those kind of nicknames in the 40s in the papers. So he got a lot of those nicknames. He made it to the Olympic Games in Germany just before World War II. And he was really young. They said he was actually one of the youngest runners that actually had made it to the Olympics, and he hadn't actually even hit his peak yet, because he was only like 19, and they say runners don't even hit their peak till early 20s, mid-20s, when they really hit their peak in running. So he didn't win the gold, but he didn't really expect to. It was more of introducing him to the world stage, and then he could go home and run professionally and win races and train and get ready for the next Olympics that were supposed to be in Japan. But the Olympics in Japan never came because World War II broke out. And so he joined the Air Force. He wanted to join the Air Force because he didn't want to see a lot of combat. And the Air Force, you can get some technical jobs that don't put you in the front, but you have to pass a lot of tests. And he was fast, but he didn't really test well. So they made him a pilot, which is the one thing he was kind of hoping he would not end up doing, was flying, because he really actually did not like flying. So they made him some tests as a pilot, and he turned out he was a better bombardier or navigator. So they put him with the bombing squad, and he was made the bombardier in a bomber, which towards the beginning of World War II, when they opened up the Pacific Theater, the beginning of the Pacific Theater in Japan, they were still playing around with a lot of bombers, and they didn't come up with really great ones at first. They kind of focused on guns and bombs and not the actual plane that they flew in. So it was made out of aluminum, barely stuck together. All the pilots and the crews hated these. I think they were called B-28s, and they fell apart often. Sometimes just gaining altitude too fast, they would lose their wingtips, or they'd lose their back rudders. And they say they had a horrible percentage of crashing. So a lot of the times, a lot of the bomber pilots and a lot of the crews played the odds, and it was kind of more of a when, not an if, you crashed. And they would just hope they did not crash over the open sea, because that is a really bad place to crash, especially in the Pacific, because it is millions and millions of square miles of open ocean with just nothing for millions of square miles, if you can even fathom millions of square miles. But they made it through almost all their missions, and their last mission they flew wasn't even actually a mission. They were searching for another downed plane before they got shipped out, and their bombing crew broke up. And the mission before that, their plane barely made it back. They belly slid on the runway with no landing gear and half a plane, their last mission. But then this other commander said, you got to go search for these guys. And they said, well, we don't have a plane. And they said, well, we've had this old rusty plane sitting on the end of the runway for a couple of months that no one wants to fly. You can fly that one. And they were not happy about that. But they had orders, and he was still training this whole time and still hoping that the Olympics would pick up. And he was trying to keep himself fit. And even that morning in his diary he wrote, the big challenge back then in the 40s, I don't know what they run the mile in now, but in the 40s, the huge challenge was to run the mile in under 4 minutes. That was like the thing to do. And he was chipping away at it all through high school, and then his best time in the Olympics was like 3 minutes and 12 seconds or something like that. So he was, or 4 minutes and 12 seconds, sorry. 4:12, 4:15, somewhere in there. So he was like just picking away at it. And that morning, actually, he was running on the beach, and he had his friend run a stopwatch and follow him in a Jeep, because he'd just run in the mornings and in the evenings. And that morning, actually, at least his friend timed him in the Jeep at like 3 minutes and 45 seconds or something that morning. So he was shattering the 4-minute mile, just waiting to get back for this war to get done so he could go and be a runner. But that was the plane, that was the last plane they flew. And that plane, as they were looking for this other crew that had went down a couple days before them, they crashed. And they had a kind of an idea of where they were, but it was pretty chaotic. If a plane crashes in the middle of the ocean, it's not a very gentle thing to plunge your bomber into the Pacific Ocean. So by the time they all resurfaced, there's 11 people in a bomber. There's tail gunners and belly gunners and navigators and nose gunners. So out of these 11 that hit the water, 3 of them made it to these life rafts that pop up out of the top of the plane. It was actually one guy's job to sit there and spread eagle and stand in the fuselage when they knew they were going to crash, because he has to pull the handles to shoot the life rafts out. And it was a well-honored but much feared position, because they said most people didn't make it. The guy standing in the fuselage holding the handles, he was pretty well gone. But his job was to make sure the rafts popped for everybody else. So it's kind of, you pick a brave man to have that position, and you all have a lot of respect for him, and you all have very sad faces when the plane goes down, because he's probably not going to make it. And he didn't. Only 3 of them made it out, and they barely got scrambled onto the raft, and not everybody else did their jobs. Everybody has a job when the plane goes down. Some people release the rafts. Some guy grabs the rations box out of the fuselage, and he has to make sure he gets out with that. None of those guys made it out, and there's pieces flying around, but there's nothing you can find. So it's just these 3 guys in these 2 rafts. And there's some small things in the raft. There's like a patch kit and a chocolate bar and a mirror and a handful of flares and some dye packs that you chuck in the water. And that's it. There's these 3 guys. And they finally clamber into the 2 life rafts and marvel at the fact that they're alive and get their brains kind of halfway together and look out, and now it's flat ocean everywhere you can see, and the occasional bit of plane bobbing in the water. Then it kind of sinks into your soul that there is nothing around for a very long, long way out. And the percentage of finding crashed crewmen was not good. And they were on their way back, actually, from not finding the previous crew. And they gave up, and they came back for the day, and they crashed. So they're not very nice feelings going on about rescue. And the 2 guys knew each other, Louis and Phil, the pilot, but this 3rd guy was kind of new. They lost 1 or 2 crew members when they crashed that plane. And so he's kind of the stranger, and they have to get to know him under bad circumstances. And a lot goes on. This whole section is kind of the big famous part of Louis' story. This is the big dramatic, this is what movies get made out of and books get written about, and this chunk. So this is pretty well documented. They spend 42 days in these 2 rafts out on the ocean. I think they said him and Phil were talking, and they had records back and forth. The previous record was like 20 some days that they knew of a crew being out before they were found. These guys, 42 days they were out, and they ended up losing the 3rd man. Him and Phil were the only 2 that made it. 42 days. 20 some days later into it, the third man died, and they fed him to the sharks, which were constantly circling their boats, their rafts, for 40 days. The sharks were just waiting for something to hit the water, and they'd even, at night, they get woken up sometimes because their fins would scrape under the raft, and they'd wake them up when they get bumped by a shark fin. And a couple of times they got some payback and caught a shark, once or twice during the 42 days. A whole lot happened. Like I say, it's pretty well documented. But they made it 42 days, and they finally find an island. But the bad thing is, you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in World War II, you have really good odds that it's a Japanese-controlled island and not an American-controlled island, especially if you're drifting with the current, because the trade currents kind of swirl up like this. They go down under Hawaii and up around past Philippines and up around the edge of Japan and then down the western coast. So if you're just floating, pretty good odds any land you hit is going to be Japanese land. And it was. And they spotted a fishing boat and they tried to get out of the way, but 42 days at the ocean does not make you a very good paddler. And so they couldn't do anything, and they floated, and this ship picks them up, and they thought it was a fishing ship, but it has a whole lot of guns and a whole lot of soldiers on it. Not a fishing ship. And they take him to this small island that's a prison island, and then they spend, I think it's 40 days, 40 days on the island, getting just slightly below rations that would just keep you alive. It's actually a little bit below starvation rations. And they stay there for 42 days, and they figure they're going to get killed because I think it's Phil or him, he figures out that it's called Death Island. That's what the Americans refer to it as, because they don't keep POWs on this island. They take people there to kill them. That's what the whole island's about. And even in his little cell, it's made out of rocks and bamboo, and he looks up at the top, and there's 9 names scratched into the rock of previous people that have been in there and never made it home, and just scratched their names in there. But while they were getting in this boat from their rafts, the Japanese searched their belongings, and Louis had kept this little cartoon about war bonds, but it's got his picture on it running in the Olympics, and it's something like, he ran for us, now he's fighting for our country, buy war bonds and be Americans. And so the Japanese find this and they think, well, he might be a good propaganda tool. And it's the only thing that really saves him and Phil's life is this little cartoon clipping in his wallet. And so they think he might be valuable, so they take him off this island, the only 2 that he knows that have ever made it off this island, and they take him to a POW camp. And things don't get a whole lot better at the POW camp. And that's another big chunk of famous story. And he survives 2.5 years, going from 2 or 3 prison camps, horrendous things that break a lot of men, and people come home and never recover from those sorts of things, and a lot of people die there. And they did not follow the set rules for POWs and prisoner camps. They say the Pacific Theater POW camps were notably worse than the European Theater POW camps, because it was, if nothing else, there was a lot more countries watching other countries about what you do to POWs and how they're returned and what shape you keep them in. And you supposedly, even back from hundreds and hundreds of years before that, how you treat officers and enlisted men, and none of that was ever adhered to much at all in the Pacific Theater. So it was not a good time, and but he made it. 2.5 years, him and this Phil guy. They've been almost starved near to death. I forget how many times throughout that whole scenario and all those things that they're enduring, and they meet this one notable person that nobody ever forgot when they met him. It was this fellow called Watanabe. That was the main guard and the boss of these POW camps. The first one he went to, he met him. Everybody called him the Bird because they would listen, and this guy was pretty well off the hinge, and he was so nervous about people talking about him. When he heard his name, he would just randomly beat people. if he heard the name Watanabe when they talked. So they referred to him as the bird, so he wouldn't hear his name when they talked about him, even if no matter what they were saying, they never wanted to mention his name, or else he'd go off the handle. The first time that he really started to fear Watanabe is when Watanabe beat him with his belt buckle once so bad that he lost consciousness. He held the leather end and hit him with the brass buckle end on his head, and he lost part of his hearing in his ear for quite some time. I don't think permanently, and he said years after that would be in his nightmares for years, this belt buckle, and it hitting him in the head. He did it more than once, but that's when he really started to fear and hate and loathe Watanabe. He was the epitome of everything that was happening to him in his POW camps. And it seemed like this man in particular wanted to break this American strong running athlete that was the picture of American vigor and American victory. He particularly wanted to destroy this man, and he did a fairly good job of it, but he made it. He made it through all those things. And like I say, most people focus on that part of the story and spend most time on that. But the thing that's interesting to me is it's a really gripping story. And we read some books and we watched a video, and like I say, 85% of the book is this bit. And then later on after he got out. But the thing that really interests me about that is this was all an unchristian man. This is all a man that has a weak faith in God, maybe a partial faith, and he meets friends, and all the friends that he makes, this Phil that he befriends, this pilot, he's the son of a preacher fella, and it seems like he has a loose faith, fairly grounded somewhat, but even that's it's not this real grounded faith. So there's these thousands of men that are together through these prison camps, and thousands make it out. Tens of thousands die, but thousands make it out, and they find their way, and they're actually rescued in their last POW camp. They think they're all going to get shot because one of the bombardiers learned Japanese, but he didn't make it out to the Japanese that he knew it. He pretended not to know Japanese, so they wouldn't do anything to him, try to get information out of him, but he'd overhear these officers talk, and right around towards the end of the war, when there was maybe 8 months left, they'd already bombed major cities in Japan, and they were zeroing in on Tokyo, and so they made this kill-all order. These officers, they said, if soldiers come to liberate the camp, the plan is nobody survives. The first thing we do is kill all the POWs, and then we escape ourselves. And that's the order that they overhear. And so, hope kind of rises up in their heart sometimes when they see, towards the end of the war, they see this bomber, this big flying fortress, fly over their camp, and some of them cheer and some of them think that's hopeful in the end of the war, but then they kind of swallow down and realize that means we're all going to die. If America gets closer, we're not going to make it. So it's this mixed, we want America to win because Japan's evil and America's great, but boy, we sure kind of hope they don't win, or worse, we're all dead. But towards the end, when their last day in captivity in a POW camp, they see one bomber go over, and then in the morning they hear this command where the whole camp gets out and they have to get to roll call. They always did a roll call every day, but then they say the activity today is they're marching to the river towards after roll call, and they all think, well, this is it. Like the whole camp gets marched out, and they get marched out into the river, and half of them are standing chest deep, and they're all standing in this river, and it's a boat dock. It's where you slide big boats off into the water, and there's POW officers standing on the walls all above them. And they just figure, that's what else are you going to do when you march everybody into the river and they all have guns? But then this whole fleet of bombers flies over them. Just like hundreds of these bombers start flying over and flying over. And the Japanese, the people that run the POW camp, are scared, so they just run. And they just leave them in the river. and they just take off. And so now this POW camp's just sitting in the river, all by themselves with no guards. So they cheer, and that's it. And they stay in the POW camp for a number of months before the Americans get to them still, but they drop supplies and pallets of these things. And at one point they had to write on the roof to stop dropping supplies because they were going bad before they could use them, because they just kept dumping pallets and pallets of food and cigarettes and magazines and all these things. And so they made it. And like I say, what interests me is there's no Christians in this bunch, maybe some professing, but we hear all these stories about all these harrowing things, and people attribute that to finding some power to do this. And what amazes me in hearing that story is they needed no Christian virtue to do this, like to survive this whole grueling thing, to live 42 days on a raft and to go through 2.5 years of torture, physical, mental, emotional torture, breakdown, and starvation, and all these things. Just, they said they were fueled by hope that they would get out, by hate for the people that were oppressing them. Just the sheer hate would give them motivation to live through this, to get back at the people that were doing it to them. Just the sheer vile hate was enough to get you through some days. Just, if I ever get out here, or if we ever get liberated, just the desire to see them on the other side of the gates was sometimes enough to make these people just grit down and live through these things. And they said some of them, even way deep down, when you're that tortured and that debased and that dehumanized, there's still something in your head that wants to live. Because there's, even in that state, people would even say, I'd rather be dead. But when you're really in that position, they'd say, I really actually would rather not be dead. Even if I'm starved and barely hanging on and dehumanized and people were hallucinating and all these things, it was still better. It's still something in you that says, I'd rather be this than dead. Some people did, and they killed themselves and they gave up. But people that made it, but that's what they were fueled by. Just self-preservation, and some with hate and just grit, and just not wanting them to win. If I die or if I give up, they win. I'm not going to let them win. So it's all of that was done in the flesh, with human ability and human power. So that was really an intense thought to me, that you can actually do these things. But then they suffered, like I say, then the books stop and the movies stop, and all the big elaborate studies of his life kind of stop, and everything else from here on in is kind of a footnote in movies and a footnote in books. But it's the rest of his life that I think is really miraculous. So that, they lived through these tens of thousands of POWs from the Pacific Theater, but now they all got to go home. The fight's over. They lived. They persevered through whatever they needed to use, grit, determination, hate, revenge, got them through, and now they won because the Japanese didn't break them down or kill them. But now they all go home. And then, but they don't realize is, for most of them, like, the real fight starts now. Because now they're not starved, and they're not oppressed, and they're not tortured, but now they got to live with all these things. They come back, these broken people, and these shattered psyches and these shattered emotions. They said 1/3 of all Pacific Theater POWs, and that tens of thousands of people were POWs in the Pacific Theater alone, so I don't know how many that is, but by 8 years after the war, they said 1/3 of them were somewhere between 50 and 100% declared 50 to 100% disabled and unable to work due to physical or emotional or psychological trauma. Somewhere between 50 and 100% of these men were completely disabled and unable to function in society by 8 years after coming back. Some of them they all had nightmares, they said, of these things that happened. Some of them would get depressed and their habits, they couldn't break these habits, and a bunch of them couldn't sleep on the mattresses. They had to sleep on the floor. They could not sleep unless they were on the floor. Some of them had to sleep in sleeping bags because they couldn't sleep they couldn't sleep out in the open because they were so used to getting smushed in that they can't sleep unless they're smushed in. And some people, this one fella said he couldn't sleep with his arms covered because he'd wake up and he'd have to defend himself about whatever he was having a nightmare about, and he just couldn't sleep if his arms were covered. He had to sleep with them out, and just all these things that these people had to deal with. And Louis had to deal with a bunch of these. He said he would sleepwalk, and he'd go through a bunch of routines. So they'd get you up randomly and come out for roll call just to make sure you're all here. So they'd do it purposely. Sometimes they'd wait till you're just barely asleep, and they'd wake up the whole camp, and then they'd give you a few hours and wake up the whole camp. So he'd go to bed and he would sleepwalk, and later his wife would say that he would just get out of bed and walk out in the living room and just stand there and do roll call. And then he'd wake up in the middle of his living room not knowing where he was. Or some of his friends, his one friend said he couldn't stay in hotels because people couldn't sleep with him screaming, because he would just wake up and just run and scream. He'd run through his neighborhood. His neighbors were nice people, and finally knew it was just because he was traumatized. So they'd wake him up and get him back to his house if they saw this guy just running down the road screaming for help. They knew it was this fella that had been in the war, so they'd go and help him and wake him up and remind him where he was and take him back to his house. And they said almost everybody drank. Said 80-some% of all of them were at some level of alcoholism. Some people would have hallucinations. They said this one fellow said he would see POWs just randomly throughout the day. People that he used to be in the camp with and they're now dead. He'd sit at a coffee shop and he'd just see like every now and then in a crowd, he would just see this dead POW. Or at a bus stop, or at work, he would see him sitting at a desk, like just this, he couldn't get out of his head. So, but they couldn't get rid of those through the flesh. Like they could live through it. They had the grit to get through these camps and to like deal with all these things and all this torture. But now they weren't winning when they got home with all this emotional stress and this trauma and all this brokenness, and they tried to drink it away, and many people got divorced and business ventures failed, and same with Louis, he was caught up on all these things. But this is something that they couldn't just get through with grit. They tried the same way they tried to get through the POW camps, but it just wouldn't work. This is what you can't win in the flesh, is this fight after you get back. And that's what Louis was dealing with when he got back. For a couple years, he would see planes fly over because he lived in Torrance. So when a plane flied over, sometimes people would freak out and crouch down and wouldn't know what to do, or have flashbacks whenever. And in Torrance, California, like there's a fair number of planes going over, and even in late 50s, 60s. So, like I say, this is. I read his book, and this is the POW camp. And this is after. Not much to go on. But this one part, I don't like to sit up here and just like read books, because you could read at home. But this is worth, I couldn't really repeat it word for word. But his wife was about to leave him. They had had a child. He had met her after the war, and she had tried her best to help him deal with these things, but it was really shattering to her and them. And she had to move out. He kept having nightmares, like I say, with this belt buckle, and this Watanabe, the bird, would show up in his dreams and just torment him. And he said sometimes he'd have the face of the devil, like the devil, what he thought the devil looked like. It was Watanabe's body, but it was the devil's face. And he just hit him with this belt and just tell him he couldn't get free. And like Watanabe would say that, like, you're mine, and he would treat him as a possession. But now in his dreams, it was the devil. The devil would say, you're mine, and you can't get free. You're in prison, and you'll be in prison. You're not getting free of this. So one night, he was trying to fight back in his dream, so he grabbed Watanabe by the neck and started choking him. But then he heard screaming, and he woke up and realized he was choking his pregnant wife on the floor in their bedroom, screaming at Watanabe. But she finally woke him up with her screams, and he obviously recoiled and sat in the corner of his bedroom and was out of his mind with remorse, but she couldn't do it anymore. She moved out, and she said, they had the baby, and she went to Miami and left the family, the children there, and came back just to go through divorce papers. And so they were in this apartment, him drinking his life away, and her just staying there so she can get this paperwork going for their divorce. And this is about the time when Billy Graham started doing these big tent meetings all over the place. And he started setting one up right in their neighborhood. And they were going through a hallway to their apartment one time. They had heard about it, but Louis was not interested in the least bit. He had seen what he would say some snake oil salesman type preachers that would set up these things and come to Jesus, have a wonderful life, and he just thought it was all a bunch of trash. He didn't think Graham was any different. But they met this couple that lived across the hall, and they were just aglow about this thing that this young Billy Graham preacher guy was talking about. And they had been a couple times, and they said their life had been changed. And it kind of grabbed hold of his wife just a little bit, Cynthia, but he was like, he walked away as soon as they started talking about it. And she wanted to go, and he didn't want to at all. But things happened here, and I think I'll read this part here. She went, and she came back, and she said, something happened, Louis. And he was like, oh, dear. Now, but the good thing was, she said, something happened to me, and now I don't want to get divorced. I want to fix this thing, because I think it can be fixed. And he was like, well, awesome, we're not getting divorced, but Billy Graham, tent thing, no thanks. But she talked him into it, and she finally got him after much asking. So yeah, I can't really repeat this word for word, so I'll read it. It's a good bit. It's only a couple pages. But this is I think the most important part of the whole story of being able to beat things in the flesh versus the spirit. Because this is the one thing nobody that came home could really win. Some people got turned into zombies and went to VA hospitals and got pumped full of drugs and kind of drooled in the corner, and they somehow beat it just by shutting their brain off or things like that. But he was looking for a way to really beat it. So she finally got him to come to this big tent thing. It says, when Graham appeared, Louis was surprised. He'd expected the sort of frothy, holy-rolling charlatan that he'd seen preaching near Torrance when he was a boy. What he saw instead was a brisk, neatly groomed man of 2 years younger than he was. Though as he was nursing a sore throat, he asked his amplifier to be turned up. And he asked his listeners to open their Bibles to the chapter of John. It says, Jesus went on the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him. And he sat down and taught them, and the scribes and the Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said unto him, Master, this woman is taken in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down, and with his finger wrote on the ground, as though he heard them not. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him be first to cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground, and they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And then Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw no one but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. It says, Louis was suddenly wide awake. Describing Jesus rising from his knees after a night of prayer, Graham asked his listeners how long it had been since they prayed in earnest. Then he focused on Jesus bending down, his finger tracing words in the sand at the Pharisees' feet, sending the men scattering in fear. What did Jesus write? Graham asked. Inside himself, Louis felt something twisting. Darkness doesn't hide the eyes of God, Graham said. God takes down your life from the time you were born to the time you die. When you stand before God on the great judgment day, You're going to say, Lord, I wasn't such a bad fella. And they're going to pull you, and they are going to pull down the screen, and they are going to shoot the moving picture of your life from cradle to grave. And you're going to hear every thought that was going through your mind, every minute of the day, every second of every minute. And you're going to hear the words that you said, and your own words, and your own thoughts, and your own deeds. And they're going to condemn you as you stand before God on that day. And God is going to say, depart from me. Louis felt indignant rage flaring in him. I am a good man, he thought, I am. But even as he thought this, he felt the lie in it. He knew what he had become. Somewhere under his anger, there's a lurking, nameless uneasiness, the shudder of sharks rasping their backs along the bottom of the raft. There was a thought that he must not think, a memory he must not see, with the urgency of a bolting animal he wanted to run. And then, of course, it's tent meeting, so Graham has to say with every head bowed and every eye closed, offering the traditional invitation of repentance. Louis stood up, grabbed Cynthia's arm, and bullied his way from the tent. So he got out of there fast, every head bowed and every eyes closed. But he goes again. That night, Louis lay helpless as the belt whipped his head again. The body that hunched over him was the bird, and the face was still that of the devil. Louis rose from his nightmares to find Cynthia there. All morning Sunday she tried to coax him into seeing Graham again. Louis, angry and threatened, refused for several hours. And they argued. Exhausted by her persistence, Louis finally agreed to go with one caveat. When Graham said every head bowed and every eye closed, they were leaving. Under the tent that night, Graham spoke of how the world was in an age of war, and how an age defined by persecution and suffering. And then goes into why God permits suffering. But it's interesting here, he says, I think to myself, when I consider the evening sky, if you look into the heavens on this beautiful California night, I see the stars, you can see the footprints of God, he said. I think to myself, my Father, my Heavenly Father, hung them there with a flaming fingertip, and holds them there with the power of his omnipotent hand. And he runs the whole universe. He's not too busy running the whole universe to count the hairs on my head and see a sparrow when it falls. God is interested in me, and God speaks in creation. This is a pretty interesting part, I think. Louis was winding tight. He remembered the day when he and Phil, slowly dying on the raft. This was probably halfway through. There were about 30-some days on the raft in the middle of the ocean. He had slid into the doldrums, but above the sky had been a swirl of light. Below, the stilled ocean had mirrored the sky, its clarity broken only by leaping fish, awed to silence and forgetting his thirst and his hunger, forgetting that he was even dying. Louis was only filled with gratitude. That day he had believed that what lay around them was the work of an infinitely broad, benevolent hand, a gift of compassion, and in the years since, that thought had been lost and buried. But Graham went on. He spoke of God reaching into the world through miracles and the intangible blessings that give men strength to outlast their sorrows. God works miracles one after another, he said. God says, if you suffer, I'll give you grace to go forward. Louis found himself thinking of the moment at which he had woken in the sinking hull of the Green Hornet. It's interesting. When they first crashed, he tried to get out. He was in the belly by the side gunner, and his leg got caught up in wires and cables that were connected to this gun and the communication device, and it was just sinking, and he was tearing at it, and he cut his leg some, panicking and drowning, trying to get out of this plane, and then he passed out. And when he woke up, he was surfaced out of the plane, not caught by his leg. No plane was nowhere to be found. He was just popped up out of the water after he passed out. That's what he was remembering. The wires that had trapped him a moment earlier now inexplicably gone. And he remembered the Japanese bomber swooping over the rafts, riddling them with bullets. There was one time when they were searching for rescue, and they'd given up all hope of planes. And they're sitting there, and there's still 3 of them then. And they see this, they hear the sound off in the distance, and they recognize it as pistons in a plane. And they just jubilant. They see this tiny little plane off in the distance shimmering, and they throw the flares and throw the bomb, the smoke packs or the powder packs in the water to make this big orange circle, and they're waving their skeleton arms and shouting, and it goes by, and they're all just sunk like, oh, that was our only hope. And then they see it bank and turn to come back, and they figure, oh, they must have seen us, and they're jumping up and down and rejoicing, and then this line of bullets start hitting the water going towards their raft, and they realize it's a Japanese bomber that caught them, and they're just going to mow them down with these guns. And so they've been sitting here with sharks circling for weeks, but now they just jump in the water without thinking, because the bullets go rip right through one of the rafts and hit the tip of one and just shred the other one. And they're underneath the raft, and then they pop back up and climb in, but then they see it come around and bank again to come back. And the other two they try to get out, but they're just wrecked. They're too starved, and so they just give up, and they just huddle in and cover their heads and cuddle into the raft. And Louis jumps out again and has to kick away like a shark or two that's coming after him. And he sees these bullets rip through the water, and a couple of them go through the bottom of the raft. The other two men are in the raft, and he sees these bullets coming through the bottom. But then he pops up, and there's no bullets where those two were huddled in the raft. And he pops back up and gets back up, and they spend the next 3 or 4 days floating and patching this raft at the same time. They have to pick up one end of the raft up out of the water, and he has to rub it and dry it and patch it. And the other guy has to hit the sharks with the paddle to keep the sharks out, because the other end dips into the water. So he's nervously patching, the other guy's hitting the sharks, the other guy's keeping the raft up. They do it for hours and hours and hours to finally patch up this one raft, and they just had to let the other one go. But that's what he sees. He remembers the Japanese bomber swooping over the rafts, riddling them with bullets, and not yet a single bullet had struck him, Phil, or Mac. He had fallen into unbearably cruel hands, and yet he had borne them. When he turned these memories in his mind, the only explanation he could find was one in which, the only scenario he could find to explain this was one in which the impossible was possible. What God asks of men, said Graham, is faith. His invisibility is the truest test of that faith. To know who sees him, God makes himself unseen. Louis shone with sweat. He felt accused and cornered and pressed by a frantic urge to flee. As Graham asked for all heads to bow and all eyes to close, Louis stood up and rushed for the street, towing Cynthia. Billy Graham shouted, "You can leave while I'm preaching, but you can't leave now." Everybody was still quiet, and every head was bowed, and every eye was closed, and he asked the faithful to come forward. Louis pushed past the congregants in his row, charging for the exit. His mind was tumbling. He felt enraged and violent and on the edge of explosion. He wanted to hit someone. As he reached the aisle, he stopped. Cynthia, the rows of bowed heads, the sawdust underfoot, the tent around him, all disappeared. Memory long beaten back, but he had long forgotten. The memory from which he had run from the evening before was suddenly upon him. Louis was on the raft. There was gentle Phil crumpled up before him, Mac's breathing skeleton, endless ocean stretching away in every direction, the sun lying over them, the cunning bodies of the sharks waiting and circling. He was a body on a raft, dying of thirst. He felt words whisper from his swollen lips. It was a promise thrown at heaven, a promise that he had not kept, a promise that he had allowed himself to forget until just this instant. He remembers whispering, "If you save me, I will serve you." And then, standing under a circus tent on a clear night in downtown LA, Louis felt rain falling. It was the last flashback he would ever have. Louis let go of Cynthia and turned towards Graham. He felt supremely alive, and he began walking. Cynthia kept her eyes on Louis all the way home. When they entered the apartment, Louis went straight to his cachet of liquor. It was the time of night when the need usually took hold of him. For the first time in years, Louis had no desire. He carried the bottles to the kitchen sink and opened them and poured their contents into the drain. Then he hurried through the apartment gathering packs of cigarettes, secret stashes of girly magazines, everything that was part of his ruined years. He heaved it all down the trash. In the morning, he woke feeling cleansed. For the first time in 5 years, the bird hadn't come to his dreams, and the bird would never come again. Louis dug out the Bible that had been issued to him by the Air Corps and mailed home to his mother when he was believed dead. He walked to Barnstable Park, where he and Cynthia had gone in better days, and where Cynthia had gone alone when he'd been on his benders. He found a nice spot under a tree and sat down and began to read. Resting in the shade and stillness, Louis felt profound peace. When he thought of his history, what resonated with him was not all that he had suffered, but the divine love that he believed had intervened to save him. He was not the worthless, broken, forsaken man that the bird had striven to make out of him. In a single silent moment, his rage, his fear, and his humiliation all fall away. And that morning he believed he was a new creation. So that's pretty awesome. And it goes on from there too. I think one of the even just as amazing, not more amazing than that. But he does find a way to even win over those oppressors that had tormented him and tortured him all those years. He found some of them after the war, years after the war. And there was a lot of war reparations and a lot of trials, nothing like Nuremberg. And they actually, to make better peace with the Japanese, they didn't charge most of the POW, most of the people running the camps in Japan. They had a statute of limitations that had run out, and they didn't pursue any charges. So there was a wake of anger and jealousy, obviously, in America when these people were just let go. But Louis actually flew to Japan a couple years later and met almost all of his POW commanders and looked them in the eye and hugged them and forgave them. Wow. And some of them, he said, were even scared of him after that. And just the power and the authority he had. Much more power and authority than anybody that ever oppressed him and beat him and humiliated him. That he forgave them. He said that was... And this Watanabe fella, he actually looked for him for a couple of years. He was hiding out under a different name. And when he had heard that all the charges were dropped, he kind of resurfaced. And Louis actually tried to meet with him a few times. But Watanabe refused. He was scared to meet this man. And he'd even heard that he had come and he'd forgiven all these other people. And one time he almost got close. He went to Japan and he went to some company or a house that he was in, and they said, "You wait here." And he was like, "Oh, I'll meet him," but finally at the last minute he chickened out. He was like, "Nah, I can't meet him." And he just kind of ran off, and Louis was just left waiting there. But and even after that, he started a boys camp for troubled boys when he was way in his late 60s, 70s, climbing hills and rocks and all this stuff he should never have done because he was all wrecked from the POW camps. But he did a bunch of stuff and had a bunch of ministries, and like I say, never once again had any flashbacks, any nightmares, any emotional stress. And he said some people would even just ball up and cry or to even talk about it. If you say, what was it like in POW camp, they just couldn't even say. But he could give these interviews and travel around and just, with a perfect heart, just share all these things that he'd gone through without a stitch of fear or flashback or emotional trauma. He could say, this is what happened. Because in a way, he loosed himself from it. He had the power to loose and bind in heaven now that he had power in the Holy Ghost. And he could release himself from all these things that other men couldn't release themselves from. They could release themselves from POW camps, but they couldn't release themselves from all this anger and hate and revenge and eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth that demands an answer for things that happen to them. And since he went and he forgave them, he was freer than any of those oppressors that had ever done anything to him. And he could look them in the eye with peace and joy, and they only looked back in confusion and fear sometimes because they weren't loosed. They had to even live. He said the hardest thing when he talked to those POW commanders, the hardest thing is they had to live with themselves after the war. They saw faces of people that they had tormented and haunted and hurt and beat to death sometimes. they would have the same hallucinations on the other end, and the same trauma, and the same alcoholism. So to meet this man that truly set himself free was the most powerful thing they'd ever seen. And so, in the end, he said that was the one thing he couldn't do. He could live through all that, and all these men could go through all these things, but they could never actually free themselves without Jesus. So there's not a lot of Bible in there. Well, there is a lot, but there's not a lot of actual cited references. But it was a powerful story. And like I say, I think the main median things skip that last bit, kind of gloss over it. But to me, that's the power of forgiveness that we have. We can set ourselves free of anything that happens to us. And I think it's hard to understand. It's hard for man to understand that how can you forgive somebody? How does that free you? That frees them, not you. Like you forgave them. Now they don't have any part in it. But truly you're the one that's set free. It reminds me of in a way we get to be unjust stewards with the forgiveness of God. We can write the tickets of God and say, you owe me retribution because of what you did to me, but I'm writing it off your tab. You don't owe the master these things because I've forgiven you. And if we can do that, then God can forgive us too. So, thank you.
Amen.